She was 8 years old, in a wheelchair, and she had already passed 3 grown adults before she reached him. The man everyone in Cedar Hollow crossed the street to avoid. The one with the German shepherd that never looked away from you. Mia Calloway's hands were bleeding from the wheels. She'd traveled almost a mile alone on cracked Nebraska sidewalk, in the cold, without stopping, because somewhere behind her, in a farmhouse no one could see from the road, someone was hurting her mother. And the dog? The retired military dog that hadn't reacted to a stranger in 4 years? He stood up. If you've never seen a story about what real strength actually looks like, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know exactly how far this story travels. The morning came in gray and close, the kind of Nebraska autumn cold that settled into the ground and didn't lift until noon. Cedar Hollow woke slowly, the grain elevator's lights cutting through mist, a couple of pickup trucks idling outside the Sunoco, the roadside market on Route 12, opening its doors to nobody in particular. Ethan Vance had been up since 5. Not because anything was wrong, just because that was when he woke up now, 4 years out of the teams, 2 years in Cedar Hollow, and his body still hadn't figured out that the war was over. He'd stopped fighting it. Easier to just get up, make coffee strong enough to strip paint, and get on with the day. His daughter Sophie was with her grandmother in Kearney this weekend. So it was just him and Ranger, which was how Ethan privately preferred most mornings. Not out of coldness, but because quiet was something he'd learned to treat like currency. You didn't spend it unless you had to. Ranger rode in the truck cab, not the bed. He was 11 now, a big brindle German shepherd with a graying muzzle and eyes that still moved faster than most people's thoughts. MWD, military working dog, retired out of SEAL Team 6's support element after a compound breach in Helmand Province left him with a damaged hip and hearing loss in his left ear. Ethan had put in the adoption paperwork before he'd even cleared his own medical board. Some decisions were easy. The market on Route 12 was where Ethan bought feed and propane. He wasn't social about it. He'd load what he needed, pay in cash, exchange exactly as many words as required, and leave. The market owner, a stout woman named Dolores Fitch, had stopped trying to make conversation about 18 months ago and had arrived at a comfortable arrangement with him. She pulled his usual order to the side, he paid without browsing, and they both went about their lives. Dolores was good people. She understood that some folks needed their space the way others needed their coffee. He was loading the last 40-pound bag of pellets into the truck bed when Ranger shifted. Not a bark, not a growl, just movement. The dog went from lying across the passenger seat to sitting upright in approximately 1 second, and his nose went to the cracked window. Ethan set the bag down without dropping it. He followed Ranger's line of sight. She was coming up the sidewalk from the south, moving fast for someone in a manual wheelchair on a surface that wasn't designed for manual wheelchairs. The concrete was buckled every few feet from tree roots, and she was hitting each crack hard, arms pumping, head down. A little girl. 8, maybe 9. Brown hair loose around her face. She wore a fleece jacket that was too light for the temperature and sneakers with one lace undone. 3 adults stood between her and the market entrance. A man talking on his phone, barely glancing up. A couple unloading grocery bags from an SUV. The girl rolled past all 3 of them without slowing, without looking at them, without asking for anything. She came straight to Ethan. Ranger had already stepped out of the truck cab. He'd nudged the door open himself, something he wasn't technically supposed to do, and moved to the edge of the sidewalk. Not aggressive, not even guarded exactly, just positioned. When the wheelchair's front wheel hit a raised crack in the concrete and the whole chair pitched forward, Ranger was already there. He pressed his shoulder into the chair frame from the side, just enough, and the girl's momentum transferred without catastrophe. She caught the wheels, stopped, looked up. Her face was dusty and streaked with dried tears, and there were fresh ones cutting through the dust right now. Her palms were raw, or she'd been moving for a while. "My mom." Her voice was thinner than a child's voice should ever be. "Someone's hurting her, please help me." Ethan crouched so he wasn't looming over her. Old habit. You lowered yourself with kids and elderly people, reduced the visual threat profile, let them feel less small. "Tell me your name," he said. Mia Calloway." "Okay, Mia. My name is Ethan." He didn't reach toward her. Ranger had already inched closer to her chair, and Mia's hand had found the dog's head without her seeming to realize it. "Are you hurt?" "No, I need you to help my mom. He's at the house, and She told me to go find someone. She said, 'Go, Mia. Just go.'" Her breath broke apart. "Who's at the house?" "Wade. He's hurt. He used to live with us. He left, but he came back this morning, and he started yelling, and I heard—" She stopped, swallowed. "Please." She locked herself in the bedroom and told me to go out the back and find help. "Where's the house?" "Out past Fenton Road, the Calloway farm. It's—" She hesitated, like she was trying to calculate something. "It took me a long time to get here." Ethan stood. He pulled out his phone and dialed the Custer County Sheriff's Office before he'd taken a single step. Not 911, the direct line, because he'd spent time understanding local response infrastructure when he moved here. "Habit, you know your AO." The duty deputy picked up on the second ring. "This is Ethan Vance. I'm at Dolores Fitch's market on Route 12. I have a young girl, Mia Calloway, says there's a domestic disturbance in progress at Calloway Farm on Fenton Road. Possible physical altercation. Adult male on the property, female occupant locked in a room. Girl traveled alone to seek help." "Got it. Units are available. ETA, just get them moving. I'm going to go take a look." A pause. "Sir, I'd advise you to—" "I'll keep my distance until your people arrive." He clicked off. Dolores had appeared in the market doorway, watching. Ethan walked Mia inside and told Dolores what he'd told the deputy. Dolores, to her credit, didn't ask 10 questions. She put a cup of hot cocoa in front of Mia, sat down next to her and said, "You stay with me, sweetheart. Your mama's going to be fine." Ethan didn't promise Mia anything. He'd learned you didn't make promises you couldn't guarantee. But he crouched in front of her one more time before he walked out. "Ranger's going to stay with you," he said. Mia's hand tightened on the shepherd's neck. Ranger didn't move, didn't look at Ethan, just settled. "Please hurry," Mia said. Fenton Road ran east off Route 12 for about 3 miles before it branched into unpaved farm lanes. Ethan knew the area generally. He'd driven it a few times, the way you drove all the roads around where you lived when you were the kind of person who didn't like surprises. Calloway Farm was on the second branch north, set maybe 200 yards off the road. He'd seen the mailbox, seen the sign, never had a reason to stop. He pulled off the road 150 yards short of the driveway, got out quietly, left the engine running with the windows down so he could hear. He could already hear, actually. A man's voice, raised and hard, carrying through the still morning air from the direction of the farmhouse. Not words, just volume and edge. The kind of voice that didn't need specific words to communicate exactly what it was doing. Ethan took his time. He walked the fence line along the gravel shoulder, keeping the old cottonwoods between himself and the house. Former SEALs didn't rush. Rushing was for people who hadn't learned what happened when you rushed. The farmhouse came into view through the trees, white siding gone gray, green shutters peeling, a porch that listed slightly to the left. A beat-up Chevy pickup sat in the drive that wasn't Ethan's. Beyond it, a woman's sedan with a cracked taillight. The screen door was closed. Through the window beside it, Ethan could see movement. A big man, wide through the shoulders, moving with the restless energy of someone who'd been drinking or was about to lose the part of themselves that kept them from doing something they couldn't take back. He was yelling at a door, an interior door, the bedroom probably, just like Mia had said. Ethan processed. One subject, apparent aggressor, no visible weapons from this angle. Subject hadn't heard him. Subject was focused entirely on the closed door. No other vehicles, no other movement. He moved to the porch steps and stopped. "Hey," he said. Just that. Loud enough to carry inside. The yelling stopped. The man, Wade presumably, appeared at the screen door. He was maybe 45, thick-necked, with the particular sunburned complexion of someone who'd done physical work outdoors for 20 years. He had the look of a person who was used to being the largest presence in any room and who'd built an entire personality around it. He looked Ethan up and down. "The hell are you?" "Just a neighbor," Ethan said. He kept his voice level. His hands were visible, down at his sides. "Heard some noise. Came to check." "This is private property." "It is. I'll wait out here." Ethan didn't move. "The woman inside, she okay?" Wade pushed the screen door open and stepped onto the porch. He was trying to fill the space, shoulders back, chest forward. It was a posture Ethan had seen roughly 10,000 times, in training and in the field and in the parking lots of bars in Virginia Beach. It meant the same thing every time. I want you afraid of me. Ethan wasn't afraid of him, but he wasn't broadcasting that. Fear wasn't the point. The point was buying time. What she is ain't your business. She in there voluntarily? A beat. Something shifted in Wade's eyes. I told you. Claire. Ethan raised his voice slightly, not aggressively, just projecting toward the closed bedroom window he could see on the south side of the house. My name's Ethan Vance. I live off County Road 7. Deputies are on their way. You can stay put. You're safe. Wade took a step forward. You called the cops? Mia reached me first, Ethan said. Something broke across Wade's face that wasn't anger exactly. It was more complicated than that. He hadn't known about Mia. He'd been so fixed on the door, on Claire, on whatever was eating him alive behind his eyes, that he hadn't accounted for a child with enough will to push a manual wheelchair nearly a mile on buckled sidewalk. For a moment, Wade just stared. Then this bedroom window opened. Claire Calloway was in her mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes and a bruise developing along her left jaw that she wasn't trying to hide. She looked at Ethan with an expression that was part relief and part something that had been held too tight for too long. Mia, she said, she's safe. She's with Dolores. Claire closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them and moved toward the front of the house, and Wade turned toward her, and Ethan took one step up onto the porch. He heard the cruiser's tires on gravel before he saw the lights. 2 units. They'd made good time. Wade saw them too. Something went out of him then. Not the anger exactly, but the momentum behind it. The thing that had kept him moving toward a bad decision seemed to realize the decision had already been made for him. Claire came out the front door and walked past Wade without looking at him. She walked down the porch steps and stopped on the grass, arms crossed over herself against the cold. Ethan stepped back, gave the deputies the space they needed. He had nothing more to do here. This was their scene now, their jurisdiction, their job. He was a civilian with a truck and a bad night's sleep, and he'd done what the situation required. He watched the deputies engage Wade, watched Wade's shoulders sink, watched the cuffs come out. Claire hadn't moved. She was staring at the cornfield to the west, the harvested stalks pale and broken in the morning light, 100 acres of finished work and cold earth. He came back about this farm, she said, to no one in particular. He's got it in his head that he put money into it and he's owed something. She paused. He's wrong. Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't required to. He waited until a deputy came to take her statement, and then he turned and walked back to his truck. He had feed to unload, a dog to retrieve. A quiet Saturday that had become something else. Behind him, the deputies were loading Wade Mercer into the back of a cruiser. Ahead of him, the road back to Route 12 lay straight and flat through the frost-killed grass. Ethan was halfway to his truck when he heard his name. He turned. Claire was standing at the end of the driveway, one arm still wrapped around herself. Wait, she said. Please, can you... She stopped, started again. Mia, can you take me to Mia? The market was warm and smelled like coffee grounds and the mild industrial sweetness of the pellet bags stacked by the door. Dolores had moved Mia to the small table near the back where the propane heaters were, and the girl had a half-finished cocoa in front of her and Ranger's head across her lap. Ranger wasn't asleep. His eyes were open. But he wasn't moving because Mia was relaxed for the first time since Ethan had seen her, and the dog had filed that information and decided his job was to keep that quality of stillness going for as long as possible. Claire Calloway walked in the door and Mia looked up. She didn't say anything, neither did Claire. Mia got her hands on the wheels and pushed herself forward fast, faster than she had any right to on an indoor floor, and Claire dropped to her knees and met her, and they held each other in the specific way of people who had been very frightened and were now very safe, which looks different from ordinary affection and sounds different too. Ethan stood near the door. Dolores materialized beside him with a paper cup of coffee without being asked. You did good, she said quietly. He took the coffee, drank it, didn't answer. After a while, Mia lifted her face from her mother's shoulder. She looked across the room at Ethan. Is he gone? She asked. He's gone, Ethan said. Mia nodded once, the way a much older person would nod, accepting an accounting of a complicated situation with minimal follow-up questions. Then she looked down at Ranger. He stayed the whole time, she said. He does that. Outside, 2 more cruisers had arrived and a deputy was walking toward the market, probably to take statements. Ethan's Saturday was thoroughly gone. He'd need to call the feed store about rescheduling, and Ranger would need his midday medication with or without the interruption, and the pellets were still in the truck bed. He was thinking about all of this in the calm, logistical way his brain ran through practical matters when Mia looked up from Ranger and said, without preamble, "Please." Her voice was very quiet. "Don't let us lose the farm too." Ethan looked at her. She wasn't crying. She'd spent her tears getting here. What was in her face now was different, something exhausted and very serious that didn't belong on an 8-year-old, and clearly had been there for longer than just this morning. "Wade says we owe money on it," she continued. "Mama says we don't, but I heard her talking on the phone about letters and numbers, and she cries sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep." Ethan said nothing. Mia looked at him steadily with the particular patience of a child who has learned that adults need more time than they should. "You could help," she said. "Couldn't you?" Ethan didn't answer Mia right away. He looked at her for a moment, this child who had already spent more courage in one morning than most adults managed in a year. And then he looked at Claire, who had straightened up from her knees and was watching him with an expression that was careful and exhausted and trying very hard not to hope for anything. "Tell me about the letters," he said. Claire blinked. It wasn't the answer she'd expected. She glanced at Dolores, who had found something important to do on the other side of the market, involving a display of canned goods. Then she looked back at Ethan. "You don't have to—" "I'm not offering anything yet," he said. "I'm asking a question." She studied him for a second. Then she sat down across from Mia, folded her hands on the table, and told him. The picture that emerged over the next 40 minutes was not a simple one. Claire Calloway had inherited the farm from her father 3 years ago, 112 acres of mixed crop and pasture land that had been in the family for 2 generations. The property carried a modest mortgage that her father had been servicing without difficulty until a bad harvest year and a health decline hit simultaneously. When he died, the mortgage had been restructured. Claire had taken it on. For 2 years she'd managed. She'd planted corn and soybeans on the productive acres, leased the north pasture to a neighboring rancher for grazing, and taken on part-time bookkeeping work to cover the gaps. It wasn't comfortable. It was functional. Wade Mercer had come into the picture about 18 months ago. He was a contractor, personable when he wanted to be, and he'd done legitimate work on the irrigation system in one of the outbuildings. He'd also, gradually, skillfully, positioned himself as someone who understood the farm's problems and could help solve them. He moved in. He contributed money toward 2 equipment repairs and made sure Claire knew about it in detail every time the subject of the farm came up. When Claire ended the relationship 8 months ago, Wade left. He also started making noise about the money he'd put in. "He's claiming a contribution of about $14,000, Claire said. "I have receipts for some of it. He paid directly for parts on 2 separate repairs. But I have nothing in writing about the arrangement, because there was no arrangement. It was a relationship. People contribute to households." "Has he filed anything?" "His lawyer sent a letter. I have a letter back from mine saying he has no legal basis." She paused. "But my lawyer also told me that if he decides to push it in civil court, the cost of defending it could—" She stopped. "Could be more than settling," Ethan finished. "Maybe." She looked at the table. "And that's not even the main problem. The main problem was the bank. The restructured mortgage had a balloon payment clause, a larger lump sum due at the end of the 5-year term, which arrived in 8 months. Her father hadn't fully understood the clause when he'd signed. Claire had inherited not just the land but the liability. The balloon amount was $62,000. She had approximately $19,000 in savings. She'd applied for a refinance through 2 lenders. One had declined. One was still considering and had been considering for 6 weeks. "And if it doesn't go through?" Ethan asked. Claire pressed her lips together. "Then I have to sell something to cover it, or I default, and they can begin foreclosure proceedings." Mia was eating the last of her cocoa with a spoon, not looking up. She'd heard this before. You could tell by the particular quality of her stillness, not oblivious, just braced. Ethan set his paper cup down. He looked at the table for a moment. The irrigation system Wade worked on. What's its current condition? Claire frowned slightly. The main line runs, but there are two lateral feeds that don't. He patched them, but didn't replace what needed replacing. They've been down since July. What about the outbuilding, the one he did work on? The smaller barn. Roof was patched, but the east wall has water damage that's gotten into the frame. How's your soil on the south acres? She looked at him more carefully now. It's tired. Dad planted the same rotation too long without amendment. 2 of those acres are basically compacted clay at this point. And your north pasture lease? What are you getting per acre? $80. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. He'd been a farmer before he was anything else. The numbers had their own language, and he could read it. 80's low for that quality of land, he said. I know. It was a handshake deal with Earl Briggs, and I didn't negotiate hard enough. I needed the income fast. Earl Briggs, Ethan repeated the name. He runs the operation on Custer Road? You know him? Enough. Ethan stood up. He picked up his paper cup, walked to the trash bin by the door, dropped it in. Stood there for a moment with his back to the table. Then he turned. I'll come look at the irrigation lines. No commitment beyond that. Claire started to say something. He stopped her with a look that wasn't unkind, just direct. I'm not a contractor, and I'm not a charity. I'm a man who knows how farms work, and I'll look at the problem. If there's something I can do that's straightforward, I'll tell you what I'd need to do it. If there isn't, I'll tell you that too. Mia had set her spoon down and was watching him with the concentrated attention she apparently gave to everything. Can Ranger come? She asked. Ranger, still positioned beside her chair, lifted his head. Ranger goes everywhere I go, Ethan said. He drove back out to the farm the following Tuesday. Not the next day. He had his own work, his daughter coming back from Kearney Sunday evening, and a fencing project on his own property that wasn't going to finish itself. He also didn't call ahead because he'd said Tuesday, and the kind of person who said Tuesday meant Tuesday. Claire was already working when he pulled up the drive. She was on her knees in the kitchen garden along the south side of the house, pulling up spent tomato plants that had frozen in the last hard frost, a wheelbarrow beside her half full of brown stalks. She stood when she heard his truck. Didn't think you'd actually come, she said. I said I would. People say things. I'm aware. He stepped down from the cab. Ranger dropped out behind him and immediately began a slow, methodical circuit of the yard perimeter, nose working. Show me the lateral feeds. The irrigation problem took him about 45 minutes to understand and about 3 minutes to diagnose. The main underground line was an older aluminum system, functional but aging. Wade had patched 2 points where the line had cracked, using a compression coupler on one and a different repair altogether on the second, a wraparound sleeve that was wrong for this type of line and had already begun to separate. Both laterals that were down traced back to these 2 patches. The first could be resoldered. The second needed about 12 feet of new pipe and 2 proper couplers. You have any PVC primer and cement in the outbuilding? Ethan asked. Probably. Dad kept a lot of supplies. He went through the outbuilding inventory while Claire watched from the door. It was a working farmer's storage space, organized originally but degraded by time and 2 years of things being returned to approximately the right place rather than exactly. He found primer. He found cement. He found no PVC pipe of the right diameter, but he found enough aluminum fittings to work with if he supplemented with one purchased piece. Hardware store in Milford carry irrigation supply? He asked. Sykes Hardware on Main. They have a decent selection. He wrote a short list. I'll get what I need. I'll be back Thursday. Claire leaned against the doorframe. Outside, Ranger was sitting near a low wooden gate that led to the vegetable beds, watching Mia navigate her chair along the gravel path inside. The path wasn't made for wheelchairs. It was narrow and uneven, and Mia was working hard to manage it, chin down, focused. Claire watched her daughter for a moment. She's stubborn, Claire said. It wasn't a complaint. I noticed. She's been that way since she was 2, long before the chair. She paused. Some people look at her and they just see the chair. They talk to me instead of her. Ask me what she can do, what she can't. She glanced at Ethan. You didn't do that. He didn't respond to that directly. He was still looking at his list. The east wall in here has water damage going up into the second floor framing, he said. How deep is the rot gone? She blinked at the change of subject. I don't know exactly. I'll look at it Thursday. By the second week, a pattern had established itself without any formal negotiation or agreement, the way patterns do when two people are both practical and neither one is particularly interested in talking about feelings. Ethan came out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He brought his tools and his truck and Ranger, and he worked until the light was gone or the task was finished, whichever came first. He ate lunch alone in his truck or didn't eat at all. He didn't expect payment and he didn't ask for it, but he also didn't frame what he was doing as a favor. He framed it as a mechanical problem that needed solving, which was a comfortable way for both of them to exist in the same space without the weight of obligation making the air thick. The irrigation laterals were restored by the end of the first week. Water moved through both lines on Thursday afternoon when Ethan opened the valve and they stood in the dormant vegetable garden listening to the system pressurize. No leaks, no separation at the new couplings. Claire said, "Huh." Ethan closed the valve. "Run it for 15 minutes every other day until the ground freezes. Keeps the line from cracking in the cold." "I know how to winterize an irrigation system," she said mildly. "Right." He didn't apologize. He picked up his tools. The wall of the small barn took longer and required more material. He tore out 3 feet of damaged framing on the east side, dried the underlying structure with a rented fan over 2 days, and replaced what couldn't be saved. The rot was shallower than it had looked from outside, which was a piece of luck. He told her it was luck, because he wasn't the type to imply he'd engineered that particular outcome. While he worked, Mia appeared. She appeared the way children do when they've been watching from somewhere for a while and have decided you're probably safe. She'd come through the low gate and navigated the uneven ground to the barn door with the combination of skill and stubbornness that seemed to characterize everything she did. Ranger materialized from wherever he'd been. He'd taken to ranging the property, but he was always within sight of the child and walked beside her chair. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Replacing framing. Hand me that." He gestured toward a short length of 2x6 near her wheel. She picked it up without asking whether she could, which he appreciated. "Thank you." She watched him work for a while. "Did you always know how to do this?" "My father taught me." "What did your father do?" "Farmed. Fixed things that needed fixing." Mia considered this. "Then why did you join the Navy?" Ethan nailed the framing member into place. The sound of the hammer in the enclosed space was definite and final. He set the hammer on the sawhorse and looked at her. "Who told you I was in the Navy?" "Dolores." Mia said it without any guilt, because she was 8 and she didn't see why that should be a secret. "She said you were a special kind of soldier, special kind of sailor. Is there a difference?" "Ask the sailors and the soldiers, they'll both tell you yes." Mia almost smiled. She looked at Ranger. "Did Ranger go with you? In the Navy?" "He was in the military. We didn't work together until later." "But you adopted him?" "Yes." "Because he needed someone?" Ethan picked up the hammer again. "Because we were both getting out and it seemed like a reasonable arrangement." It was during the 3rd week that Cedar Hollow got involved, which was not something Ethan had planned or encouraged. It started with Earl Briggs. Earl Briggs was 61, built like a man who'd spent 40 years doing physical labor and hadn't slowed down, and he was the kind of local figure who was so thoroughly embedded in a community that his opinions had the quality of weather, something you couldn't exactly argue with, just worked around. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, leased several thousand acres, including Claire's North pasture, and had opinions about most things, and no particular hesitation in sharing them. He showed up at the farm on a Wednesday, which was not one of Ethan's days, but Ethan was there anyway because he'd realized the soil amendment work on the South Acres needed to start before the ground was fully frozen if it was going to do anything by spring planting. He was working a compost spreader he'd borrowed from a contact in Milford when Earl's truck came up the drive. Earl got out, looked at Ethan, looked at the spreader, looked at the field. "You're amending the South Acres," Earl said. It wasn't a question. "Trying to," Ethan said. "Those are basically dead. 2 of them might be. 4 of them aren't." Earl studied the field. He had the farmer's habit of reading soil the way other people read faces. He walked to the edge of the worked ground and crouched, picked up a handful, rubbed it between his fingers. "What are you putting in?" "Compost and lime first pass. Come spring, we'll look at what the soil test says and go from there." Earl let the soil fall, stood up. looked at Ethan with an expression that was evaluating something. "You're Vance," he said, "the one who lives off County Road 7. "That's right." "Navy man." Ethan didn't respond to that. "People in town think you're peculiar," Earl said, with the directness of a man who considered diplomacy a waste of time. "People in town are welcome to their opinions. I'm not criticizing, I'm making an observation." Earl looked at the field again. "You know your way around a farm." "My father's farm, yes." "Where was that?" "Western Kansas, Finney County." Earl grunted. "Hard country." "It was all right." Earl put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the barn, at the replaced siding on the east wall, at the winterized garden rows, at Ranger sitting near the vegetable beds watching Mia while she worked on something with a small trowel. "What's your stake in this?" Earl asked. "No stake." "Everybody has a stake." "A girl asked me not to let them lose the farm," Ethan said. "That's all this is." Earl was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who took information in slowly and processed it without any of that processing being visible on his face. "The lease," he said finally. "I'm paying 80 per acre on the north pasture." "I know. That's below market." "I know that too." Earl gave him a long look. "Claire never said anything." "She needed the income." Another silence. Earl took one of his hands out of his pocket and scratched the back of his neck. He had the expression of a man who had just realized he'd been getting a better deal than he'd consciously acknowledged, and didn't particularly enjoy that realization. "Current market rate's closer to 110, Earl said. Ethan didn't respond. He reached for the spreader controls. "I'll talk to her about adjusting the lease," Earl said, "going forward." "That's between you and her," Ethan said. Earl nodded once, got back in his truck. He sat for a moment with the engine idling, looking at the field through the windshield. Then he rolled the window down. "You need lumber for that outbuilding? I've got a pile of seasoned 2x6s I'm not using." Ethan looked at him. "How much?" "Nothing. They're taking up space." Ethan held his gaze for a second. "I'll take what I need," he said. "I'll return what I don't." Earl made a sound that might have been approval. He rolled the window up and drove out. The lumber appeared 2 days later, dropped at the end of the driveway with no note. Shortly after that, Dolores brought canning supplies and a covered dish and left them on the porch without knocking. A woman named Susan Haverford from the Methodist Church, she came without the church component, just as herself, showed up one Saturday with her teenage son and $200 in seed money she framed as, "I had it sitting around doing nothing," which is wasteful. Ethan was not entirely comfortable with any of this. He was a man who had spent most of his adult life operating in small, tight-knit units where everyone understood their role and there was no ambiguity about who did what and why. Community organizing was not a skill set he'd developed, but he recognized what was happening. People had been watching, had been looking for an entry point, had needed someone to move first before they felt they could. And he could either lean into it practically or waste energy being resistant. He leaned into it practically. He made a list. He sorted what needed skilled labor from what needed bodies and time. He kept Susan's son on tasks that were safe and clear, clearing dead growth from the vegetable beds, stacking the new lumber, building a simple compost bin from a plan Ethan drew out in 5 minutes on the back of a hardware receipt. He put Earl Briggs's fence post to use on a section of the north pasture perimeter that had been sagging since summer. What he didn't do was talk about himself. People tried. Earl, who had started coming by more than the lumber delivery required, made a few probing attempts, the kind of questions that started with the farm and rotated toward Ethan's past in a widening circle. Where he'd served, what kind of operations, whether the dog was trained for... "He's trained for whatever the situation requires," Ethan said, and went back to what he was doing, and Earl, to his credit, didn't push. The rest of Cedar Hollow was less restrained. Ethan became aware, in the way you become aware of weather moving in, that he had become a subject of community conversation. Not necessarily unkind, more like the particular interest a small town develops when something doesn't fit its existing categories. I was a veteran, which was understood. He was a father, which was known. He was clearly capable with his hands and clearly not interested in advertising it, which was unusual. He'd walked onto someone else's property during an active domestic dispute and handled it without violence or drama, which people were still reconstructing and adjusting their understanding of. He heard things secondhand through Dolores, who heard everything through the market. People are saying you must have been some kind of operator, she told him one Thursday morning when he came in for supplies. People say a lot of things. They're not wrong, are they? Ethan paid for his items. You want me to say something specific, he said. Dolores leaned on the counter. I want you to understand that this town hasn't had someone like you in it, and they don't quite know what to make of you, which means they're filling in the gaps themselves. You might prefer what you'd say to what they're imagining. I might prefer neither. She sighed. Suit yourself. He picked up his bags. At the door, he stopped. I was a SEAL for 14 years, he said. I did things I'm not going to talk about in a hardware store. The dog worked a support role in a direct action element. We're both retired. That's what there is to say. Dolores nodded. Was that so hard? She asked. He went out without answering. The thing about Mia was that she didn't treat him the way other people treated him. Most people, once they understood what he'd been, shifted their behavior in some direction. Either they became slightly formal, a little careful, the way people got around someone they'd reassessed as more dangerous than they'd thought, or they overcorrected the other way and started projecting qualities onto him that he didn't particularly have, like unshakable calm and perfect judgment and the kind of wisdom that came from having seen things. Mia just treated him like he was there. She asked him practical questions about what he was doing and occasionally helped when she could reach things from her chair and occasionally told him things were wrong when she thought they were wrong, with no particular deference to his expertise. That path is too narrow, she told him one afternoon, when he was laying down a gravel walkway along the vegetable bed perimeter, a wheelchair-accessible route Claire had mentioned wanting and that Ethan had included in his mental list without making a production of it. He stopped and looked at the path. It's 30 inches, he said. My chair is 25 inches, but when I turn I need more. Also, the gravel is going to be hard to push on. I'll pack it tighter. You should put a harder surface under the gravel, like pavers or something flat. He looked at her. I've been in a wheelchair my whole life, she said. I know what works. He adjusted the path. He added a layer of compacted, decomposed granite under the gravel, which made it significantly easier to push on and which he should have thought of himself and would have, he told himself, given another day. When it was done, Mia tested it in both directions and made one full circle around the beds without difficulty. Better, she said. Thank you. You're welcome. She stopped near the gate. Ranger was beside her, his hip close to her wheel, which had become his default position with her. Close enough to be useful, not so close as to impede her. My mom cried last night, Mia said. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was collecting his tools. About the bank letter? I don't know. Maybe. Mia was quiet for a moment. She doesn't usually. She tries not to let me see, but I heard through the wall. He set the tools in the bucket. Your mom is handling a lot, he said. Crying about it doesn't mean she can't manage it. I know. Mia looked out over the dormant garden. The rows were visible, bare and brown but organized now, the beds cleaned of frost-killed growth, the soil amended where it had been depleted. The farm looked different than it had 6 weeks ago. Not finished, not solved, but tended. I just wish she didn't have to be scared. People who love someone tend to carry that. Mia looked at him. Are you scared of anything? He picked up the bucket. Yes. What? He considered whether to answer. She had a way of asking questions that made deflection feel more trouble than it was worth. Getting things wrong when it matters, he said. She thought about this with the same concentrated attention she gave to everything. Like at our house? That morning with Wade? That's one example. But you didn't get it wrong. No, but I could have. And the distance between those two outcomes is thinner than people want to believe. Mia was quiet. She looked at Ranger. I was scared to ask you for help, she said. That morning, you're kind of... She searched for the word. Big and serious. I know. But Ranger walked toward me first. She reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear, and Ranger pressed into her hand with the particular devotion he showed only to people who had earned it through patient, consistent proximity. So I figured you were probably okay. Ethan almost said something, decided against it. He picked up the bucket and walked it back to the truck. The second letter from the bank arrived on a Friday in late November. Claire called him. She had his number from the coordination calls earlier in the month, and she read it to him over the phone with the flat voice of someone trying to stay analytical about news that was anything but. The refinance application had been declined. The lender cited insufficient income documentation and an inconsistency in the property's assessed value versus the outstanding loan balance. The letter was careful and professional and communicated, in the bureaucratic language of financial institutions, that the Calloway Farms mortgage would mature in approximately 7 months and the balloon payment would be due in full. When she finished reading, there was a pause. "All right," Ethan said. "All right," she repeated with a slight edge. "That's your response." "I'm thinking." "Ethan, $62,000. I know the number." Another pause, longer. He could hear her breath. "I have a contact at a USDA Farm Service Agency office in Grand Island," he said. "He owes me a conversation. The FSA has emergency loan programs specifically for this scenario: inherited property, restructured debt, balloon payment risk. They're underutilized because people don't know they exist or they don't meet the application correctly." Silence. "You have a contact at the USDA," Claire said. "I have contacts in several useful places. I don't make a habit of mentioning them until they're relevant. And you didn't mention this before because the refinance was the cleaner path, and it made sense to let that resolve first." He heard her exhale. Slow, controlled. She was working through something. "What would I need to put together?" she said finally. "Everything you have. Income records, the original mortgage documents, the restructuring agreement, your soil test results when we have them, projections for the spring planting. The FSA values evidence of farm viability." He paused. "The work we've done on the property helps. Documented improvements are material to the application." "How do you know all of this?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father lost a farm when I was 16, he said. "We didn't know those programs existed. By the time someone told us, the foreclosure was already in process." He stopped. "I've known about them ever since." The line was quiet. "Ethan," Claire said. "I'll call my contact Monday morning," he said. "Get your documents together this weekend." He hung up before she could say whatever she was going to say next. He set the phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in his own kitchen, which was clean and spare and had a child's drawing on the refrigerator, his daughter Sophie's rendering of Ranger, who looked like a brown rectangle with legs. And he looked at nothing in particular. Ranger walked over and put his chin on Ethan's knee. Ethan put one hand on the dog's head and left it there. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall on Cedar Hollow, coming down quiet, and even in the last gray hour before dark, covering the fields and the roads and the dormant garden rows in something that looked, from a distance, like a fresh start. But there were things that snow didn't cover, because that same afternoon, on the other side of Cedar Hollow, Wade Mercer made his first phone call to a civil attorney in North Platte and began asking, very specifically, about the legal definition of unjust enrichment and whether improvements made to a property by a romantic partner could constitute a claim against that property's equity. And the attorney, after listening for 8 minutes, told him he might have something worth pursuing. Wade Mercer's attorney was a man named Douglas Hale, and he operated out of a glass-fronted office on the second floor of a building in North Platte that was trying very hard to look more expensive than it was. Hale had been practicing civil law for 22 years, which meant he was experienced enough to know a weak case from a strong one, and pragmatic enough to take the weak ones anyway when the hourly rate justified the effort. Wade's case was not strong, but it wasn't nothing. The legal theory Hale had identified was narrow but real. Under Nebraska law, a non-titled party who made documented financial contributions to a property's improvement or maintenance could, in certain circumstances, pursue a claim of unjust enrichment against the titled owner. The key word was documented. Wade had paid for parts and materials directly, by check, which meant there was a paper trail. The amounts were modest, but modest wasn't zero. More importantly, Hale explained, the value of the claim wasn't in winning, it was in the cost of defending. "If we file," Hale said in their second phone call in early December, "she's going to need an attorney to respond. That costs money. If we time this correctly, we file right around the window where her balloon payment is coming due, when her finances are already stretched. The pressure compounds." Wade was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to destroy her," he said, and Hale, who had been practicing long enough to recognize a man lying to himself, made a neutral sound and moved on. The filing was prepared over the following 3 weeks. It was served on Mia Calloway on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December by a process server who drove out Fenton Road and left the envelope with her at the door because there was no avoiding it. She called Ethan before she'd even gone back inside. I was at his own kitchen table when the call came. Going through the FSA application package, his contact in Grand Island had helped him compile. His contact's name was Marcus Webb, a veteran himself. Army, not Navy, which Ethan and Marcus had maintained a mutual, low-key argument about for 8 years without resolution, who worked as a loan officer in the FSA's Nebraska state office, and who had told Ethan, when he'd called, that the Calloway situation was exactly the type of case the emergency loan program existed for, and that if the documentation was thorough, the timeline was workable. The documentation was thorough. Ethan had made sure of that. He'd photographed every repair and improvement, printed the soil test results with the agronomist's written assessment, compiled Earl Briggs's revised lease agreement with its adjusted rate, and assembled a simple 5-year farm viability projection that he'd written himself based on realistic yield estimates for the South acres under amendment and the current market rate for soybeans and corn in the region. It wasn't a professional business plan. It was a working farmer's honest accounting, which was what the FSA preferred anyway. He was reviewing the section on improvement documentation when his phone rang. He filed, Claire said. Her voice was controlled. Barely. A civil suit, unjust enrichment. He's claiming the work he did on the irrigation system and the outbuilding increased the property's value, and he's owed a portion of that. Ethan set down his pen. How much is he claiming? $22,000. He was quiet for a moment. His attorney knows it won't hold, Claire said. My lawyer called me 20 minutes after I called her. She said the claim is thin and she can respond to it, but responding costs money. She quoted me a retainer. Claire's voice had gone very flat. Ethan, I don't have a retainer right now. I barely have the $19,000 I've been holding back for the balloon. He picked up the pen, set it down again. Okay, he said. Don't pay anything yet. Don't make any decisions today. My lawyer is saying I need to tomorrow, he said. Give me until tomorrow morning. A pause. What are you going to do? He looked at the FSA application on the table, thought about Marcus Webb, thought about the $22,000 claim, the balloon payment timeline, the legal retainer, the specific arithmetic of a situation that was designed to compress. I'm going to make some calls, he said. The first call was to Marcus. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When Ethan finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. The civil suit doesn't directly affect the FSA application, Marcus said, but it's going to show up in the due diligence if it's active when we submit. A pending legal claim against the property is something reviewers flag. Can we submit before it formally enters the court calendar? Maybe. What's your current timeline on documentation? I can have everything finalized in 4 days. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a sigh. That's tight. I'd need it by end of business Thursday to get it logged before the Friday review cycle. If it goes into Friday's cycle, the earliest it moves is mid-January. Then I'll have it to you Thursday. Ethan, 4 days to finalize a package we were giving 3 weeks to. I understand the timeline. Another pause. All right, Thursday. And it needs to be clean. No gaps in the documentation. Ethan hung up and looked at the table. Then he called Claire back and told her what needed to happen. I need every document you have. Original mortgage, restructuring agreement, 3 years of income records, every receipt for farm-related expenses. I need them scanned or photographed clearly, labeled, and in my hands by tomorrow afternoon. That's, Ethan, I have to go through my father's files. Some of this is in boxes in the, then start now. He paused. I know it's a lot. Start now. She started. He drove out to the farm the next morning because Claire's scanner was broken and she'd been photographing documents with her phone, which was fine for some things and inadequate for others. He brought his laptop and a portable document scanner and set up at the kitchen table while Claire moved in steady rotation between the filing cabinet, the boxes in the spare room, and the table, handing him documents in batches. Mia stayed out of the way. This was unusual enough that Ethan noticed it. She typically orbited any activity in the house with quiet interest. But she'd taken Ranger to the living room and was doing something with a book and a blanket, and she stayed there, and he understood that she was reading the atmosphere correctly and giving them the space that the atmosphere required. The kitchen had the particular quality of a room where focused, pressured work is happening, coffee going cold on the counter, papers spread in organized piles, the soft mechanical sound of the scanner working through documents. Claire had organized her records better than she'd implied. Her father's files were complete if old, and she'd maintained her own records with the careful attention of someone who had always known, at some level, that they would eventually be necessary. By early afternoon, they had the core package. Then Claire put a document on the table that Ethan hadn't expected. "What's this?" he said. "My father's original property assessment, from when he bought the North 40 acres in 1987. She sat down across from him. "There's a notation on the deed, an easement agreement with the neighboring property, the Winslow parcel. It was a water access easement. The Winslows needed access to the creek that runs through our north corner." Ethan scanned the document, looked up. "Is the easement still in place?" "The Winslow property sold 4 years ago. I don't know who holds it now or whether the easement was renewed." She paused. "My lawyer mentioned it when we talked last year. She said if the easement is active and was never formally documented in the county records, it could complicate the property's title status." He read the notation again. It was handwritten in the margin of the 1987 deed, which meant it had likely never been properly formalized, which meant it was either a non-issue or a potential cloud on the title, depending on how you read Nebraska property law, and whether the current owner of the former Winslow parcel had ever formally asserted the easement. "Do you know who bought the Winslow parcel?" Claire looked at him steadily. "A company called Meridian Land Holdings," she said, "out of Omaha." The name didn't mean anything to Ethan, but the structure of it did. A land-holding company buying a rural Nebraska parcel was either a tax vehicle or a prelude to something. Either way, it wasn't a farmer, which meant the easement, informal as it was, might be something they'd looked at. He set the document aside. "We include this in the package," he said, proactively. "We note the easement, its informal status, and the fact that we're initiating a title review. The FSA prefers disclosed complications to discovered ones." "Will that hurt the application?" "Less than if they find it themselves." She nodded. She trusted his read on this, which was something that had developed over weeks without being explicitly negotiated. He went back to the scanner. At 4 in the afternoon, Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the table, at the organized stacks, at the laptop screen, at Ethan's coffee cup, which had been cold for 2 hours. "Are you hungry?" she asked. Neither of them had eaten anything. "Yes," Ethan said. Mia disappeared into the kitchen and came back 20 minutes later with 3 bowls of soup she'd heated from a can, crackers, and 2 glasses of water. She'd done it entirely independently, navigating the kitchen from her chair, which she knew well enough to manage with minimal difficulty. She set a bowl in front of Ethan, set one in front of Claire. "Eat," she said, with the authority of someone who was 8 years old and completely serious about it. Claire looked at her daughter for a moment with an expression that she quickly organized back into something more neutral. She picked up the spoon. Ethan ate his soup. It was chicken noodle from a can, and it was fine. Well, the package went to Marcus Webb on Thursday at 4:50 p.m., 10 minutes before the end of business. Marcus sent back a single-line confirmation. "Received. We'll review Friday. Talk Monday." Ethan closed his laptop. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the Milford post office, where he'd driven to send hard copies of several notarized documents by overnight courier as backup. Ranger was in the passenger seat. The sun was going down behind the grain elevator across the street, turning the sky the particular shade of orange that Nebraska winters produced in their last hour of light. He sat there for a few minutes and didn't do anything. Then he drove back toward Cedar Hollow. So, the call from Marcus came Monday as promised, and the news was cautiously good. The application was complete. The documentation was among the cleaner packages Marcus's office had received, and it would move to formal review within the week. The emergency loan program had sufficient funds available for the current quarter. Timeline to decision was 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. The balloon payment was due in 7. It was close. Closer than comfortable. but it was workable if nothing else went wrong. The problem was Douglas Hale. Hale was not a man who waited for the other side to stabilize before applying pressure. He filed the civil suit formally on the 15th of December and immediately moved, which was unusual in civil proceedings, and suggested that the timing was deliberate. Get in front of a judge while the other side was still organizing their response, create urgency, make the numbers worse before the other side could make them better. Claire's attorney, whose name was Janet Rowe and who practiced out of Broken Bow, filed a motion to set a standard timeline. The court would likely grant it. But the motion cost hours of Janet's time, and hours were dollars, and the retainer Claire had managed to put together by drawing down $3,000 from her savings, dollars she could not really afford, was moving. Ethan found this out on a Wednesday afternoon when he arrived at the farm, and Claire was sitting on the porch steps in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the temperature, staring at the cornfield. She didn't move when he parked, didn't look up. He sat down on the step beside her. Ranger went to the barn because he'd learned the barn was where Mia usually was in the afternoons, and Mia was his afternoon priority. Rowe called, Claire said. I heard some of it from Marcus. He'd called Marcus Monday after the hearing news came through. How much did you hear? Enough. She pulled her coat tighter. A muscle moved in her jaw. I feel like... She stopped, started again. I feel like every time I get one thing stable, something pulls from the other side. Like there's someone standing at the other end just... She gestured vaguely. Pulling. Wade's attorney is running a pressure strategy, Ethan said. He's not interested in the merits of the case. He's interested in what happens to your finances if the legal costs run long enough. I know that. She turned and looked at him directly. Knowing it doesn't make it stop working. He didn't say anything to that because it was true and deserved acknowledgement rather than a counter. Janet thinks I should consider a settlement offer, Claire said. Something small, under $10,000, just to make him go away. What do you think? I think it's a payoff. I think it establishes that applying pressure to me works, and anyone watching can see that. He nodded. What does Janet think about the case itself? She says the unjust enrichment claim is weak. The improvements Wade made were routine maintenance, not capital improvements that materially increased property value. His expert would have to argue that patching an irrigation line and putting a partial roof repair on an outbuilding constitutes appreciable equity contribution. Claire's voice went dry. Janet's words were, quote, that's an argument a judge is going to find unpersuasive. Then we don't settle. It costs money to not settle. It costs more to settle and have him come back. She looked at him. Her eyes were tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing too many things for too long without enough sleep. You keep saying we, she said. Do I? Like it's your problem too. He was quiet for a moment. Ranger had appeared from the barn with Mia's chair wheels visible in the shadow of the barn door behind him, the dog moving in his quiet way between his two people, checking on both ends of his territory. My father's farm was in Finney County, Ethan said. Western Kansas. About 900 acres, which sounds like a lot, but most of it was marginal rangeland. We ran cattle and planted winter wheat on the productive ground. He stopped, restarted. When I was 16, a drought hit. Third straight bad year. The bank had a note on the cattle operation, standard operating loan. When we couldn't service it, they called it early. It was in the contract, technically legal, but the timing was... He paused again. My father had options he didn't know about, programs he'd never heard of. By the time someone told him, the process was already in motion. Claire was watching him. We lost it before Christmas that year, he said. My father spent the next 6 years working other men's land. He never talked about it, but you could... He stopped there. The silence held for a moment. You could tell, Claire said quietly. You could tell, he agreed. He stood up from the step. I'm going to look at the north fence line before the light goes, he said. Earl mentioned it was down in 2 places near the creek. He walked toward the fence and Claire sat on the porch step and watched him go. And she didn't say anything, and that was the right choice because there was nothing to say to something like that wouldn't cost it something. The town meeting that nobody officially called happened on the Thursday before Christmas Eve. It was at Dolores Fitch's market, which had a back room with folding tables that was sometimes used for 4-H events and county extension meetings. Dolores had arranged the tables without consulting anyone and put a sign in the window that said, in hand-lettered marker, Community Meeting, Calloway Farm, Thursday, 6 p.m., back room, everyone welcome. Ethan had not been consulted about this. He found out about it Tuesday afternoon when Dolores called him. I didn't ask your permission, she said immediately, before he could speak. I noticed. And I'm not going to apologize. This community has known that family for 30 years, and there are people here who want to help, and they don't know what to help with or how, and you are the only person who has an actual picture of what's needed. A long pause. I'm not a public speaker, he said. I know. You can sit in the back and answer questions when people have specific ones. Earl will handle the general talking. He's been wanting to since September. Earl. He's better at it than you'd think. He's been farming in this county for 40 years. People respect him, and he is, I think this surprised him too, actually angry about this situation. The Wade piece. He has opinions. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. 6 p.m. Thursday, he said. Dressed like a person, Dolores said. He showed up at 5:50 in a clean flannel shirt, which was as far toward dressed up as he went. Ranger stayed in the truck, which Ethan had parked down the block because the dog in a crowded back room was one variable too many. There were more people than he'd expected. Not a crowd exactly. Cedar Hollow wasn't that large, but the back room was full, maybe 30 adults, a few older teenagers who'd come with parents. Earl Briggs was at the front near the whiteboard that normally held 4-H prize announcements. There were people Ethan knew by sight and people he'd never seen, which meant the meeting had pulled from beyond Cedar Hollow's immediate core. Claire was not there. He'd specifically not told her about it. Some things needed to be arranged before they were presented, and this was one of them. Earl opened without preamble. Most of you know the situation at the Calloway place, he said. Claire Calloway is dealing with 3 things at once: a balloon mortgage payment in 7 months, a legal harassment campaign from a man who doesn't have a case but has enough money to make the case expensive, and a farm that's been in her family since before half of us were born. He paused. Some of you have already helped. I know Susan Haverford's family put in seed money and time. I know at least 4 other families have brought materials out there. That's good. But what's in front of us now is more specific. He turned to Ethan. Vance, you want to tell them where things actually stand? 30 people looked at Ethan. He sat in a chair near the side wall, which he preferred to standing. He kept his voice direct and short. The briefing register, which was the one he was most comfortable with. There's an FSA emergency loan application in review, he said. That could cover the balloon payment if it clears. Timeline is 4 to 6 weeks, which lines up with the due date if it moves on schedule. The risk is anything that slows the review. An active legal claim against the property is a complicating factor, which is why Wade Mercer's civil suit is designed the way it is. A man in the third row, Ethan didn't know him, said, "Can't someone just make that go away?" The suit exists. It has to be responded to legally. What kills it faster is a solid counterfiling that makes the judge question why it was expedited in the first place. That requires Janet Rowe's time. What does her time cost? At current pace, another $3,000 to $4,000 to get to a dismissal hearing. The room was quiet for a moment. Earl said, "That's the number we're here about." What happened next was not dramatic in the way that movie scenes were dramatic. Nobody stood up and made a speech. Nobody cried. A retired schoolteacher named Harriet Moon said she could contribute $500 from her December budget without difficulty. A grain cooperative representative named Cole Dutton said, the cooperative had a community support fund he could draw against for equipment use. Not cash, but equipment use had cash value. A young couple that ran a market garden operation outside town offered 2 days of labor the following week toward any task that needed bodies. Earl had a legal pad and was writing things down. After 45 minutes, the room had produced $4,200 in pledged direct contributions, access to a commercial tractor for spring planting at no cost for 30 days, the labor equivalent of roughly 80 person-hours across 6 families over the next month, and 300 pounds of seed stock from 2 different operations that had surplus. It wasn't $62,000. It wasn't a solution to the balloon payment, but it was the retainer that kept Janet Rowe moving. It was the seed stock that made the spring planting viable without additional purchase cost. It was the tractor that made the amended South Acres plantable without rental expense. Each thing reduced the pressure 1 notch. A problem under enough pressure snaps. A problem under managed pressure sometimes finds its level. Ethan sat against the side wall and let Earl run the room, because Earl was better at it, and because this wasn't his community, exactly. He'd been here 2 years and didn't have the roots these people had, and because what he'd been asked to do was provide accurate information, not lead anything. At the end, Dolores looked at him from across the room. He gave her a nod that meant good call, because it had been. He told Claire the next morning. He sat across from her at the same kitchen table where they'd compiled the FSA package, and he laid it out the same way he laid out everything, plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She had both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the first pale light of the morning was coming through the kitchen window, and Ranger was visible in the yard, doing his slow perimeter walk in the frost. "You organized that," she said. "Dolores organized it. Earl ran it. You told them what to give." "I told them what was needed. There's a difference." She looked at her cup. "People I haven't spoken to in 2 years showed up to that meeting," she said. He waited. "I don't know what to do with that," she said quietly. Not upset, just honest about it. "I've been out here alone for so long, trying to handle everything alone because asking felt like—" She stopped. "I don't know what it felt like. Admitting I couldn't. Asking for specific help with a specific problem isn't the same as admitting you can't handle things," Ethan said. "It's resource allocation." She looked up at him. There was something in her expression that was trying to decide how to feel about his particular way of engaging with the world. The flat language and the practical frame that was underneath it, neither cold nor dismissive, but was simply the only register he'd ever found that held together under pressure. "Resource allocation," she repeated. "It's a real term." "I know it's a real term." She almost smiled. Not quite. Then Mia rolled into the kitchen, Ranger at her wheel, and she looked at both of them with the assessing gaze she'd deployed since the first morning. "You look better," she told her mother. "I feel a little better." Mia looked at Ethan. "Did it work? The meeting?" He looked at her. "You knew about the meeting." "Dolores told me on Tuesday. She said not to tell Mom." She was correct. Mia nodded, satisfied. She pulled toward the refrigerator. "Are you staying for breakfast?" He almost said no, because staying for breakfast was a step from a different category than fixing irrigation lines. It implied something about what this was that he hadn't fully decided. But it was 6:40 in the morning, and he'd driven out here at first light because he hadn't slept past 5. And there was no particular reason to drive home to an empty house when the coffee was here and the work was here, and "If there's enough," he said. Mia opened the refrigerator, assessed its contents with serious concentration. "There's enough," she said. He sat back down. Douglas Hale called Wade Mercer on the 23rd of December to let him know that the court had denied the expedited hearing motion. Standard timeline. Earliest date on the docket was late February. Wade sat in his apartment in North Platte, a 2-room place that felt smaller than it was because he was a large man with large furniture and not much going on in it, and looked at the wall. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means the clock isn't working the way we planned," Hale said. "By February, she may have the FSA situation resolved. If she does, the financial pressure is off, the property's title is cleaner, and a judge looks at our filing and sees a nuisance claim against a woman who just secured emergency agricultural financing. So it falls apart." "It was always going to fall apart in front of a judge," Hale said. "The question was whether it fell apart before or after it accomplished something. February is cutting it close." Wade was quiet for a long time. "I just wanted—" He stopped. Hale waited. "She was supposed to be struggling by now," Wade said. "Without me." Hale had no legal advice applicable to that statement. He said he'd keep the filing active pending Wade's instructions and ended the call. Wade sat in the apartment. Through the wall of the building, he could hear his neighbor's television, a football game, crowd noise rising and falling. He thought about the farm, the irrigation lines he'd worked on, the outbuilding's east wall where he'd put in 2 days on the ladder in August heat. He'd done that work. Nobody was going to tell him he hadn't, but somewhere in the arithmetic of what he'd done and what he'd expected and what had actually happened, something had gone wrong. And the number he kept arriving at, the number that sat in the quiet of the apartment like an accusation, was that he had looked at a woman managing alone and had decided that was leverage instead of difficulty. He didn't think that thought in exactly those words, but it was close enough that it sat in his chest and didn't move. The FSA decision came in the third week of January. Marcus Webb called Ethan first at 7:15 in the morning, which was earlier than business hours, and which told Ethan something before Marcus had said a single substantive word. It cleared, Marcus said. Ethan sat down at his kitchen table. Full amount? Full amount, 30-year term at the emergency rate, disbursement to the existing lender in 60 days. A pause. The easement notation was reviewed. Because you disclosed it proactively and had initiated a title search, the reviewers treated it as a managed item rather than a red flag. That was the right call, including it. I know. The application was one of the cleaner ones I've seen in 6 years of doing this. I want you to know that. Thank you, Marcus. Tell the family. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone on the table and Ranger's chin on his knee, the same position as the November evening when the first refinance had declined. The light in the kitchen was the pale, flat light of a January morning in Nebraska. No warmth to it, just enough to see by. He called Claire. She answered on the second ring, and he could tell from the sound of her voice, slightly too awake for 7:15, slightly too controlled, that she'd been up waiting. It cleared, he said. The sound she made was not a word. It was a long exhale that had been held in place for months by the specific effort of not letting herself believe something was going to work before it actually did. He waited. Full amount? She finally said. Full amount. Another silence. He could hear her moving in the kitchen, the specific sound of someone who has just received information too significant to receive standing still and is walking in a slow circle without deciding to. Ethan. Her voice was different now, stripped of the careful management. I know, he said. She stopped. I don't have a word for what you did. You did the work. I helped with the paperwork. Don't do that. He was quiet. Don't make it smaller than it was, she said. Please. He didn't argue with that. I'm going to call Janet Rowe, he said. The FSA decision changes the legal landscape. Wade's attorney is going to want to recalculate. Okay. A pause. Ethan. Thank you. He set the phone down after the call and sat in his kitchen and looked at the refrigerator where his daughter Sophie's drawing of Ranger was held up with a magnet shaped like a corn cob. Nebraska, in small ways, was relentless about being Nebraska, and the rectangular brown dog with the stick legs looked back at him from the paper with the particular serenity of a child's rendering that contains more truth than accuracy. Ranger had moved to the door. He was looking back at Ethan. Yeah, Ethan said. He got up, found his keys, and went to tell the Calloways in person, because some things you shouldn't deliver over the phone. Outside, the January fields were white and flat and still, the kind of landscape that looked like nothing was happening and was, in fact, under the frozen surface, quietly preparing for spring. The road out to Fenton Road was glazed with overnight ice that hadn't been sanded yet, and Ethan drove it at 40 miles an hour with both hands on the wheel and Ranger sitting straight in the passenger seat, which was how the dog rode when Ethan's energy said this matters. The fields on either side were white and unmarked, no wind yet, the kind of January morning that was quiet in the way of something held rather than something at rest. The sun was coming up flat and pale behind a layer of high cloud. His breath fogged slightly in the cab despite the heater. He'd been in this truck on this road more times in the past 4 months than he could easily count, and the drive had stopped feeling like a direction he was choosing, and had started feeling like a direction he was going, which were different things and which he hadn't fully decided how he felt about. He pulled into the Calloway driveway at 7:50. Claire was already on the porch. She had a coat on over what appeared to be pajamas, and she was holding a coffee cup with both hands, and she looked like someone who had received large news and then needed to stand outside in cold air to confirm that the world was still arranged in the way she remembered. He stepped out of the truck. She watched him cross the yard. Say it again, she said. FSA cleared the application. Full amount, 30-year term, disbursement in 60 days directly to your lender. She pressed her lips together. The muscle in her jaw moved. She was not going to cry in front of him, which he understood was a deliberate choice that he respected. 60 days, she said. That's before the balloon. Correct. And the legal situation? I'm calling Janet Rowe when her office opens at 8:30. The FSA decision changes the landscape materially. Wade's claim was built on financial pressure. the theory that the legal cost would compound against the balloon payment and make settlement attractive. Remove the balloon from the equation, and his attorney has a pure merits case. On the pure merits, he doesn't have one. Janet said that. His attorney knows that too. Ethan put his hands in his jacket pockets. Hale's going to recommend Wade withdraw. It's the economically rational move. Claire looked at him for a long moment. You've been thinking about this like a tactical problem, she said. That's how I think about problems. Since when does a farmer think like that? He held her gaze. Since the farmer spent 14 years doing other things first. She looked at her coffee cup. A pause that had several things in it. Come inside, she said. Mia's up. She's going to want to hear this from you. Mia heard it sitting at the kitchen table with a half-eaten piece of toast in front of her, and her reaction was to become very still, which was what she did when she was processing something significant. Then she looked at Ranger, who was sitting beside her chair. We're keeping the farm, she said. The financing is secure, Ethan said. Yes. And Wade? That's being handled. Mia looked at him with the particular direct attention she'd been deploying since the first morning. How? Legally, through the appropriate process. That's not a real answer. It's the answer I have right now. She considered this, accepted it, which meant she'd filed it as incomplete rather than satisfactory, a distinction she would return to. She picked up her toast. Okay, she said. Claire poured Ethan coffee without asking whether he wanted it, which was a thing that had quietly shifted somewhere in the past month. The small, frictionless accommodations that develop between people who have spent enough concentrated time in proximity. He sat down at the table. I'm going to need you to do something, he said to Claire. What? Call Hale's office directly, before Janet does. Tell him you're prepared to offer Wade a written statement acknowledging his material contributions to 2 specific repairs, with a dollar amount that matches his actual documented expenditure, not $14,000, the documented amount, which is closer to 6, and a release of all further claims. Claire set down her cup. You want me to give him something? I want you to give him the minimum true thing that closes this permanently. A judge would give him nothing. His attorney knows that. But Wade is not a rational actor and Hale has to manage him. If you lead with an offer that's small but accurate, Hale can take it to Wade as a win and recommend acceptance. If you wait for Janet to move first, Hale frames it as capitulation and Wade digs in. Claire stopped. That's a negotiating position. It is. Where did you learn? She looked at him. Never mind. Go ahead. She shook her head slightly. You keep surprising me, and I keep almost asking about it, and then you say something that tells me a small piece, and then I realize I don't actually know. She stopped again. What did you do exactly? In the Navy. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran. I was a SEAL for 14 years, Ethan said. The last 6 years I was attached to a specialized element. We worked in environments where the conventional military couldn't or didn't operate. Small teams, specific objectives, usually at night, usually in places no one was going to officially acknowledge we'd been. Intelligence? Reconnaissance? Sometimes. Direct action more often. He picked up his coffee. We also did a significant amount of what got called MISO work, military information support operations, influence operations, understanding how an adversary thinks and what moves will produce what responses. He set the cup down. You learn a certain kind of patience. You learn that the direct move is not always the fastest move. Mia was listening with her toast held in both hands and completely forgotten. Did people get hurt? She asked. Mia, Claire said. It's a real question, Mia said. Ethan looked at her. Yes. Did you? Mia stopped. Yes, he said before she could finish. The kitchen was quiet again. Were they bad people? Mia asked. Some of them. Some of them were following orders the way most people follow orders, which is without enough time to think about whether the orders are right. He paused. War is not a clean situation. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Mia put the toast down. She looked at Ranger for a long moment. Is that why you and Ranger both got out? She asked. Ethan looked at the table, back up at her. That's close enough, he said. Wholesome. Janet Rowe called at 8:45, which was 15 minutes after Claire had reached Hale's office and left a message. By 9:20, Hale had called Claire back. By 10:15, he had communicated that he was recommending his client accept the offer. By noon, Wade Mercer had agreed. The settlement document was 4 paragraphs long. It acknowledged Wade's direct material expenditure of $5,800 toward 2 specific property repairs, issued a written thank you for that contribution, and released all parties from all further claims arising from the relationship or the property. It was signed electronically by close of business. Janet Rowe called Claire to confirm. "That was unusually fast," Janet said. "How did you know to approach Hale directly?" "Someone advised me," Claire said. "Their advice was good. Hale told me, off the record, that his client was ambivalent about the whole thing and was looking for a way to step back that didn't feel like losing. You gave him that." "We gave him the accurate number," Claire said, "which happened to also be the number that let him save face. That's not an accident." After she hung up, Claire stood in the kitchen and looked at the window over the sink for a long moment. Ethan was outside. She could see him through the glass, working on the wheelchair path along the vegetable beds, extending it east toward the chicken enclosure, which had been on the list since December. He was moving steadily, the way he moved through all physical work, without performance and without pause. She watched him for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went outside. "Oh, it's done," she said. He didn't stop working. He set a paver stone and pressed it level with his boot before looking up. "All of it?" "Wade signed," Janet confirmed. "The FSA paperwork is in process." She crossed her arms against the cold. "It's done." He nodded. Went back to the next paver. "Ethan." "Yes." "Put the stone down." He put the stone down. He looked at her. "I need you to let me say something," she said, "without you redirecting it into logistics." A pause. "Go ahead." "You came here in October because an 8-year-old asked you not to let us lose this place." She kept her eyes on him directly. "And you could have done one thing, fix the irrigation. That was the one thing. Left." He didn't respond. "Instead, you spent 4 months fixing everything you could find that needed fixing, organizing a community meeting you didn't want to attend, calling in a contact you'd apparently been holding since you were 16 years old and your father lost his farm, and running a negotiating strategy against a civil attorney that I'm still not entirely sure how you knew to run." She stopped. "I'm not saying any of this to make you uncomfortable," she said. "I'm saying it because I want you to know that I see it, all of it, the parts you didn't announce, and the parts you made smaller than they were, and the parts you did at 5 in the morning when you thought no one was paying attention." He was looking at the paver in his hand. "I'm not good at," he started. "I know you're not," she said. "That's not what I'm asking for." He set the paver down on the stack. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he said. Not an apology, just an honest statement. "Here as in this farm, or here as in—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Both," he said. "That makes 2 of us." She looked at the vegetable beds, the amended rows, the path he was building toward the chickens. "But for what it's worth, I think you know exactly what you're doing on this farm. You just don't know what to do with the people who are attached to it." He looked at her. "That's possibly accurate," he said. Something close to a smile moved across her face. Not quite, but close. "Breakfast is at 7 if you want it," she said. "That's not an obligation, it's an open offer." She went back inside. He stood in the cold for a moment. Then he picked up the paver and went back to work. The debrief happened in February. That was how Ethan thought of it later, as a debrief because that was the frame that fit. It happened in the conference room of the Custer County Extension Office in Broken Bow, which was a beige room with fluorescent lights and a folding table and chairs that were approximately comfortable, and it involved Ethan and Claire and Janet Rowe and a representative from the FSA district office named Patterson, who had driven up from Grand Island to walk Claire through the final loan documentation in person. Patterson was late 40s, experienced, with the manner of a bureaucrat who had spent enough time working with farm families in distress that the bureaucratic manner had softened at its edges into something closer to actual engagement. He shook Ethan's hand when they were introduced and held the handshake a beat longer than standard. "You're the one who put together the application package," Patterson said. "I helped with the documentation." Marcus Webb said it was the clearest income and viability package his office had received in 2 years. Patterson looked at him. "You have a background in agricultural finance?" "My father farmed. I've kept up with the programs." Patterson nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who could tell when a short answer was all he was going to get and had made peace with that. The meeting took 2 hours. Patterson walked Claire through every section of the loan agreement in terms that were thorough without being condescending, which Ethan noted and appreciated. The interest rate was fixed. The disbursement timeline was confirmed. The title review had cleared the easement issue. The Meridian Land Holdings Company, upon inquiry, had never formally asserted the easement, and their attorney had provided a written statement that they had no current interest in doing so. Janet Rose sat at the corner of the table with a yellow legal pad and made notes. She had the practiced attention of an attorney who knew that the documents her client signed today would govern her client's life for 30 years, and she read every page before Claire signed it. At the end, when Claire had signed the last signature block and Patterson had gathered the documents and was preparing to leave, he stopped at the door and looked back at Ethan. "There's a technical assistance position that opens periodically through the FSA's Nebraska District Office," he said, "helping farm families with exactly this kind of situation. Application assistance, financial restructuring, program navigation. It's part-time, contract basis." He paused. "I don't know your situation, but you clearly have the knowledge and you know how to talk to people who are in a difficult place without making it worse. That's rarer than it sounds." Ethan looked at him. "I'll think about it," he said. Patterson nodded. "Marcus Webb can give you the details." He left. Janet was putting papers in her briefcase. She looked up at Ethan over the edge of her reading glasses. "You should do it," she said. "I haven't decided anything." "I know. I'm telling you my opinion, which is that you should do it." She snapped the briefcase shut. "You're good at this. The problem-solving part and the people part, even though you clearly find the people part exhausting." She stood. "Not many people are good at both. I'm not particularly good at the people part. You kept this family from losing their farm, and you got a man to walk away from a legal harassment campaign by giving him an accurate accounting of his own expenditures and calling it a win." She raised an eyebrow. "That's the people part." He didn't respond to that. She said goodbye to Claire, shook Ethan's hand briefly, and left. Claire and Ethan were alone in the beige conference room. "You're going to say no to the FSA thing," Claire said. "I haven't decided." "You made a face." "I don't make faces." "You made a face," she said firmly. "When Patterson mentioned it, a specific face that you make when something is directly relevant to you and you don't want to acknowledge it." He looked at her. "I make a specific face." "You do. I've had 4 months to learn your faces. There aren't that many of them." He picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'm going to think about it." "That means no." "It means I'm going to think about it." She studied him. "Is it because of Sophie scheduling?" Sophie was in Cedar Hollow now, had been since November, when Ethan's mother-in-law had relocated to Kearney, and the arrangement that had Sophie splitting time no longer made logistical sense. Sophie was 7, in 2nd grade at the Cedar Hollow Elementary School, and had met Mia 6 weeks ago when Claire had come to the hardware store on a Saturday with both kids in tow, and Sophie had climbed into Mia's lap in the chair within 4 minutes of introduction, which had startled everyone present except Mia, who had simply looked down at Sophie and said, "You can stay there if you want." "Sophie's fine," he said. "Her schedule's manageable." "Then what?" He held his jacket. "It means I'd be on call. For families in the worst months of their lives. Families who are—" He stopped. "This one was hard enough." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Because it was personal," she said. "Because I made it personal." He said it flat, without inflection. "That's not the same as it being the right approach." "It worked. This time." She looked at him carefully. "You're afraid of caring about something you can't fix." He put on his jacket. "I'm aware of the risks of emotional investment in outcomes you can't fully control. That's a professional concern, not a personal one." "That's the same thing you just said with different words." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside the conference room's single window, the February sky was the flat white of snow that was coming but hadn't arrived yet. "I'll think about it," he said. And this time he meant it, which was different. The conversation with Earl Briggs happened 2 days later, and it was the conversation that Ethan hadn't planned, and that turned out to matter more than most of the ones he had. Earl appeared at the Calloway farm on a Thursday afternoon, not his scheduled grazing day, just appearing, which was Earl's way of announcing that he had something to say that wasn't farm business. He found Ethan in the small barn running a final inspection on the east wall repair before declaring it finished. Earl looked at the wall, looked at the new framing and the vapor barrier and the reskinned exterior siding. "Good work," he said. "Thank you." Earl leaned against the barn door. He had his jacket open despite the cold, because he ran warm the way large men who worked outdoors often did. He was quiet for a moment in the way that Ethan had come to understand meant he was getting to something. "People in town are talking about you differently than they were in September," Earl said. "I've noticed. You don't care." "I care appropriately." Earl made a sound. "You know what I told my wife about you early on? I told her I didn't know what to make of you. You were here, but you weren't here, went to the market, went home. Dog, truck, that's it." Ethan kept his eyes on the wall. "My wife said, 'Give him time,'" Earl continued. "She's usually right about people, but I didn't know what she meant until the morning with Claire and the Mercer situation." He paused. "I've seen people handle stress different ways. Seen veterans who were a mess outside the structure. Seen ones who were fine, mostly. You're something different." "What's that?" "You're someone who knows exactly how much force a situation requires and uses exactly that much, not more." Earl looked at him. "That's not a common thing." Ethan picked up his level, checked the bottom framing member out of habit. "My platoon chief told me something in my second year," he said. "He said the discipline isn't knowing how to apply force. Any trained person can do that. The discipline is knowing when not to." "Sounds right." It took me a while to understand what he meant. Ethan set the level down. "You think about it differently when the stakes are kinetic. When the wrong read costs someone's life, it sharpens you. And then you get out and the stakes are lower, but not actually lower because they're people's lives, just slower ones. And the same discipline applies, but the frame is completely different, and you have to rebuild how you read situations." Earl was quiet, listening. "Cedar Hollow was that rebuilding," Ethan said. It was more than he usually said to anyone, and he said it to the wall rather than to Earl, which was the only way it was going to come out at all. Earl was silent for a long moment. "You've done all right at it," he said finally. Ethan picked up his tools. "I've had a specific situation to work on," he said. "That helps." Earl pushed off the door frame. He started to leave, then stopped. "My daughter-in-law runs the county extension program," he said. "Farm education for families, some youth programming, some soil conservation outreach. She's been looking for someone to do field consultation for the past 6 months. Can't pay much, but it's useful work, and it's here." Ethan looked at him. "Patterson at the FSA mentioned something similar," he said. "I know, he's my second cousin." Earl's expression was completely neutral, just mentioning it. He walked out of the barn. Ethan stood in the repaired space for a moment, alone except for the smell of new lumber and cold air, and he thought about his platoon chief, who had been a quiet man from rural Georgia, who believed that the most important skill a person could develop was understanding what a given moment actually required of them. Not what they'd trained for, not what they were equipped for, but what this specific situation, with these specific people, in this specific place, was asking. The answer was usually simpler than you expected and harder than you wanted. He told Sophie about the FSA position on a Sunday evening. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing second-grade homework, a worksheet about community helpers, which struck Ethan as a specific kind of timing that life sometimes produced, and she had her tongue pressed to her lower lip in the concentration expression that she'd had since she was 3. He sat down across from her. "I have a question for you," he said. Sophie looked up. She had her mother's eyes, which Ethan tried not to think about often. "What?" "I've been asked to do some work helping farm families when they're in trouble, with money stuff, paperwork, figuring out what they need. It would mean sometimes I'd be somewhere else when you got home from school. Mrs. Alderman would be here." Sophie considered this. "Like what you did for Mia's mom," she said. "Similar. For other people?" "Yes." She went back to her worksheet, wrote something, looked up. "Mia said her mom cried when she found out about the loan," Sophie said. "She said it was a good cry." "That's what Mia told you?" "She said there are different kinds of crying." Sophie looked at her worksheet again. "Did you make that happen? The good cry?" He thought about the accurate answer. "A lot of people helped," he said. "But you started it." He didn't respond. Sophie wrote something else on the worksheet. "You should do the job," she said. It's important. You think so? You always say find work that's important, she said. You told me that. He looked at his daughter bent over her homework, 7 years old and certain about things with the clarity that children had before the world taught them that certainty was expensive. I did say that, he agreed. He went to his phone and called Marcus Webb. The spring arrived the way Nebraska springs did, not gradually, but in a series of hard shoves, freezing and thawing and freezing again. Until 1 week in late March, the ground gave up resisting and opened, and the smell of turned earth came back across the fields. Ethan was on the South Acres with Earl's borrowed tractor when the FSA disbursement landed in Claire's account. She texted him 2 words. It's here. He turned the tractor at the end of a row and came back across the field, laying the 5th pass of the season through the amended soil, and he didn't stop working because the field didn't care about disbursements, and the amended ground was ready, and the planting window was a specific and unforgiving thing. But when he reached the end of the row and killed the engine for a water break, he sat on the tractor seat in the pale March sun and looked at the field. 5 passes of dark, turned earth against the pale dormant grass of the margins. 112 acres of land that had gone from exhausted and encumbered to financed and alive. And he allowed himself one moment of something that wasn't exactly satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Ranger was at the field's edge, sitting near the fence line, watching him. The dog had the stillness of an animal that had learned that some moments didn't require action, just presence. Ethan climbed down from the tractor. Mia was at the field's edge too, which he noticed as he walked toward the water jug he'd left by the fence post. She'd come out along the new gravel path from the barn, navigating the uneven ground at the field's margin with the specific focused attention she brought to anything that required navigation. And she'd parked herself near Ranger with a small notebook in her lap that she'd been using since February to track what was planted where in the vegetable beds. "What are you planting in the south corner?" she asked, pointing to the far end of the turned rows. "Soybeans. Soil's too depleted for corn yet. Beans will fix some nitrogen back in." "Then corn next year?" "Depends on the soil test in fall. Maybe." She wrote something in the notebook. She had, at some point in the past 2 months, decided that understanding the farm's agricultural logic was part of her domain, and she had been asking questions with the systematic persistence of someone building a knowledge base rather than satisfying casual curiosity. "My teacher said we could do our project on soil science," she said. "I said I knew someone who knew about it." "You can bring her out here," Ethan said, "if your mom's okay with it." "Mom will be okay with it." Mia looked at the turned rows. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Are you going to stay?" He picked up the water jug, drank, set it back. "I'm doing work for the FSA," he said. "County Extension is talking to me about some consultation. My place is on County Road 7. Mia looked at him with the patient, precise attention she'd had since the first morning. "That's not what I asked," she said. He looked at the field. "I'm here on Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said, "and most Saturday mornings now, and Sundays when the tractor needs something, and breakfast on weekdays when Sophie doesn't have school." He said nothing. "That's most days," Mia said. He picked up the water jug and walked back to the tractor. "Get inside," he said. "It's cold." "It's 42 degrees. It's cold." She turned her chair toward the path. Ranger fell into step beside her wheel. At the tractor, Ethan climbed back up. He started the engine. The field spread out in front of him, dark and ready and waiting for what came next. He turned the tractor at the fence and made his 6th pass. The 6th pass brought him back to the fence line, and the 7th took him away from it, and by the time the morning was finished, the South Acres were turned and ready, and the sky had gone from pale to something with actual color in it, which in Nebraska in late March was a thing worth noticing. He killed the engine at noon. The farm was quiet in the way working farms went quiet at midday. The chickens settled, the equipment still, the fields lying open under the high sun. Somewhere on the other side of the barn, he could hear Mia talking to someone, the particular cadence of a child explaining something she considered important to a person who was listening carefully. He climbed down from the tractor and walked toward the sound. Mia was at the low gate to the vegetable beds, her notebook open on her lap, talking to a woman he didn't know. The woman was maybe 60, with a county extension lanyard around her neck and the sensible boots of someone who spent a significant portion of her working life on agricultural property. She was crouched at Mia's level, listening, and she had a notepad of her own. Ranger was sitting between them, equidistant, watching both with the calm supervision he extended to any gathering of people he'd decided to vouch for. Ethan stopped at the corner of the barn. The woman looked up. "Mr. Vance?" "Yes." She stood and extended her hand. "Diane Briggs, County Extension, Earl's daughter-in-law." He shook it. "Your soil amendment program on the South Acres," she said. "Mia's been walking me through it." He looked at Mia, who had the expression of someone who had been waiting to be acknowledged and was trying not to show it. "She knows it better than most adults would," Diane said. "She's been tracking it since February." "She asks good questions," Ethan said. "So do you, apparently. Earl has been talking about the work you've done here for 3 months. Diane looked at the turned field. "The consultation position. I know Patterson at the FSA mentioned something similar. I want to be clear that what we're offering is different. It's not just application assistance. It's on-the-ground field consultation, going out to farms, assessing what's actually happening with soil and water and structure, connecting families with the right programs before they're in crisis." She paused. "It's more useful than the paperwork side, in my opinion, and harder to find someone qualified to do it." Earl mentioned the position. "Earl mentions things he thinks need to happen," Diane said. "Whether anyone listens is a different matter." Mia was watching Ethan with her notebook open and her pen uncapped, which was either a coincidence or a statement. "The position can be structured around your schedule," Diane said. "Part-time to start. Some families would be in this county, some neighboring counties. You'd need a vehicle, which you have, and basic soil testing equipment, which we can provide." "What's the case volume?" "Currently, we have 11 families in the county who've been flagged as high risk for foreclosure or significant financial distress in the next 18 months. That number typically grows through spring as operating loans come due." She paused. "Some of them will be fine with the right information early enough. Some won't. But all of them deserve someone showing up before the letter comes from the bank." Ethan looked at the field. Someone showing up before the letter comes. He thought about his father in 1991, standing in the kitchen of the Finney County farmhouse with an envelope from the bank and the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that a door has closed that he didn't know was moving. Nobody had shown up before that letter. "I'll take it," he said. Diane nodded, without drama. "Good, I'll send you the paperwork." She said goodbye to Mia, thanked her for the soil tour, and walked back toward the driveway. Mia looked at Ethan. "You took it," she said. "I took it." She wrote something in her notebook. He almost asked what, but he didn't. The thing about Wade Mercer that Ethan found out in April was not something he'd looked for. He was at the FSA district office in Grand Island for his first formal orientation meeting when Marcus Webb mentioned it. Not as information directed at Ethan specifically, just in the course of a conversation about a family in Dawson County whose situation had some structural similarities to the Calloway case. "It's a pattern we see," Marcus said. "Former romantic partner claims financial contribution to property. Usually the claim is marginal, but the pressure is real. The Calloway situation resolved cleanly, but we had a similar one in Sherman County last fall that went to a full trial and cost the family 18 months. "What happened in Sherman County?" "They kept the farm. Barely." Marcus shuffled papers. "Your Mercer case. His attorney withdrew after the settlement. Hale's firm dropped him as a client, actually." Ethan looked at him. "Dropped him?" "Professional decision on Hale's part. Word gets around in small civil practice. When a case is built primarily on financial attrition and falls apart when the attrition stops working, that's," Marcus chose his words, "that's a pattern that creates certain reputational considerations." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And Wade?" "Don't know. Not my business." Marcus looked up from his papers. "Not yours either." That was probably true. But Ethan thought about it on the drive back to Cedar Hollow. Not with satisfaction exactly, and not with residual anger, but with the particular complexity of a man who understood that people who did harmful things were rarely one-dimensional villains, and that understanding didn't require forgiveness or absolution, just accuracy. Wade Mercer had looked at a woman managing a loan and decided that was an exploitable condition. That was a real thing he'd done, and it had caused real harm, and the settlement and the dropped attorney were a real consequence. That was how it should work. But Wade had also worked in August heat on an outbuilding roof and written checks for irrigation parts, and probably meant some of it as something other than leverage at the time. People were not usually simple, which did not make them less accountable. It just made the accounting more complicated. He drove back through the flat March-going April landscape with the windows down and Ranger's nose working the moving air, and he filed the Wade Mercer situation in the category of things that had resolved as well as could reasonably be expected and didn't require further processing. He had 11 families on a list. He had work to do. The spring planting on the South Acres went in during the second week of April. Ethan was there for it, running the planter attachment on Earl's tractor while Claire walked the field edges and Mia tracked seeding density in her notebook against the rates Ethan had given her, which she'd converted into a color-coded spreadsheet on the farm's laptop with Sophie's enthusiastic and partially inaccurate assistance. Sophie was at the farm most Saturdays now. This had developed without formal negotiation, the same way most things in this situation had developed, through the simple mechanism of it making sense. Sophie and Mia had formed the specific friendship that sometimes emerged between children of different ages when one had something to teach and the other was genuinely interested in learning it. And what Mia had to teach was extensive: how to navigate the world from a chair, how to read a horse's ears to understand its mood, how to track data with enough rigor to be useful, how to ask adults direct questions and wait for actual answers. Sophie was a fast learner. On the Saturday of the planting, the two girls were at the field's edge in the mid-morning sun, Sophie standing and Mia in her chair, both looking at the planter making its rows. Sophie had a handful of soybean seeds she'd taken from the planting bag and was examining them in the particular way of a child who has decided she needs to understand what a thing actually is before she can be satisfied with knowing what it does. "They don't look like much," Sophie said. "They're not supposed to yet," Mia said. "How does something this small turn into a whole plant?" Mia considered the question seriously. "Ethan says it's about conditions. The seed already knows what to do. It just needs the right conditions." Sophie looked at the seeds in her palm. Then she looked at the rows the planter was laying down. "Does the field know what to do?" "The field is the conditions," Mia said. Sophie thought about this for a moment. Then she put one seed carefully in her jacket pocket because she had decided she needed to keep it, which was the kind of decision that 7-year-olds made without requiring a reason. Claire was watching them from 10 yards down the fence line. She had her arms crossed, and her face was turned slightly toward the sun, eyes half closed, and she had the look of a person who has been underwater for a long time and has finally surfaced and is paying attention to what breathing feels like. Ethan brought the tractor around at the end of the row and killed the engine near the fence. "South quadrant's done," he said. "Wind's picking up from the northwest. I want to finish the center rows before it gets above 12 knots, or we'll get seed drift." "You say knots," Claire said. He looked at her. "Miles per hour. I want to finish before it hits 15. "You said knots." "Old habit." She smiled at that. A real one, not the careful version she'd had in the early months. The real one reached her eyes and stayed there a beat longer than the polite kind. "Go finish your rows," she said. He went back to the tractor. The dedication happened in early June, which was Mia's idea, and which she'd organized with a level of logistical competence that surprised everyone except Ethan, who had stopped being surprised by Mia approximately 2 months into knowing her. She'd called it a farm opening, which was not a traditional agricultural event category, but which accurately described what it was. The first day the Calloway Farm Educational Program was officially open to visitors. 6 families from the area had signed up for the first session. Parents with children who had various physical and developmental differences, drawn by a flyer that Mia had written herself and that Claire had posted at the county extension office and the pediatric therapy clinic in Broken Bow. The flyer said, in Mia's direct prose, "Come learn to grow things. Everyone can grow something, no experience necessary." Ethan had read it and told her it was good. She'd said she knew. The morning of the opening, the farm was ready in the imperfect, real-world way that things are ready when a lot of people have worked on them without unlimited time or resources. The raised vegetable beds were built to accessible heights, with the compacted granite under-gravel paths Mia had specified running between them. The chicken enclosure had a gate modified to open with a single hand. The wheelchair route from the parking area to the barn and then to the garden ran smooth and level and had been tested by Mia in both directions in both dry and wet conditions. The small barn had a whiteboard and 4 low tables and chairs in 2 sizes, adult and child, and smelled like new wood and earth. Dolores Fitch brought coffee and rolls without being asked and set them on the porch table and then stood back and didn't offer to help with anything else, which was the right read of the situation. Earl Briggs stood near the fence with his wife, a compact, observant woman named Ruth, who had said approximately 40 words to Ethan in all the time he'd known Earl, and who he had concluded was the more capable of the two by a significant margin, and watched the families arrive. 3 of the children were in wheelchairs. 1 had braces on both legs and walked with forearm crutches. 2 had no visible physical difference but held their parents' hands with the particular grip of children who were uncertain in new places. Mia positioned herself near the parking area. She did not wait for someone to come to her. She rolled toward each family as they arrived, introduced herself by name, asked the children's names, and then, without preamble, without the excessive cheerfulness that adults sometimes deployed with children they considered fragile, began telling them what they would do today. We're going to plant basil and check on the tomato seedlings, and if there's time, I'll show you how to tell if a chicken is happy or stressed by how it holds its feathers. I know that sounds weird, but it's actually useful. A small boy on forearm crutches looked at her chair. Is it hard to garden in that? He asked. Depends on the garden, Mia said. That's why we built this one the way we did. Come on, I'll show you. She turned her chair and led them through the gate. Ethan watched from near the barn. Beside him, Ranger sat with his attention on Mia. Not anxious, not on alert, just watching, the way he watched everything he'd decided was his responsibility. Claire appeared at Ethan's shoulder. She's been planning this since February, Claire said quietly. I know. She made a spreadsheet of every accessibility modification and rated them by importance. Then she and Sophie built a priority list. Claire paused. Sophie's contribution to the priority list was that the chicken gate needed to be lower because, and I quote, some wheelchairs are shorter. Sophie's not wrong. No. Claire watched her daughter move through the garden with the group of children around her. She's going to do something large with her life. She already is, Ethan said. Claire looked at him. He was watching the garden, and he had the particular expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the face of a man who was feeling something he hadn't made room for and was making room for it now, slightly awkwardly, because that was how he did things. She put her hand on his arm briefly, just briefly. He didn't move away. The session ran 3 hours and ended with every child having planted something in a small pot to take home. Basil, mostly, with 2 tomatoes and 1 very optimistic attempt at a pepper by the boy on the forearm crutches, who had decided that if he was going to grow something, it should be challenging. Mia had walked them through the planting process with the practical directness she applied to everything, and she'd handled the moments when something was physically difficult for a particular child. A grip that didn't work, a reach that wasn't quite there, by adjusting the setup rather than the expectation, which was what good teaching looked like regardless of the subject. When the families were leaving, the boy with the crutches stopped at the gate. Are you coming back? He asked Mia. I live here, she said. Can I come back? We're doing this every other Saturday until fall, she said. Your parents can sign up at the extension office. He nodded, serious. He looked at his pepper pot. What if it dies? Come back anyway, Mia said. We'll figure out why and try again. He walked to his parents' car. Mia watched him go. Ethan was loading the last of the tool storage back into the barn, and he heard that exchange from 12 feet away, and he stopped moving for a moment. We'll figure out why and try again. 8 years old, and she already understood the most important thing there was to understand about working with living things. That failure was information, not verdict, and the correct response to it was to understand it and continue. He'd learned that at 26, in a training environment that made the lesson expensive. She'd apparently arrived there on her own. He went back to loading tools. In July, Marcus Webb's office processed the first application Ethan brought in as a consulting agent for the FSA program, a family in Valley County, 4th-generation cattle operation, 92 acres, operating loan called early after 2 consecutive drought years. The situation was structurally similar to what his father had faced in 1991, different only in the details and in the fact that this time, someone had shown up before the letter arrived. The application cleared in 3 weeks. Marcus called to tell him. 2 for 2, Marcus said. It's early, Ethan said. I know it's early. I'm noting the data point. Note it. Ethan was in his truck, heading back toward Cedar Hollow from a site visit to a Custer County grain operation that Diane Briggs had flagged. What's the current caseload for the district? We're tracking 31 operations at some level of risk in the 5-county area. 7 of those are what I'd call acute. Decision window is within the next 9 months. Send me the 7. You sure? Send me the 7. A pause. You know the position doesn't require you to… Marcus. Sending the 7, Marcus said. The files came through by the time Ethan reached Cedar Hollow. He pulled over on the county road outside town and read through the summaries on his phone. Not to solve anything today, just to understand the shape of what was in front of him. The way you looked at a field before you worked it. Get the lay of the land, note where the problems were. Understand what the soil wanted before you decided what it needed. 7 families. 7 sets of people who had built something over years or decades and were now in the specific kind of danger that didn't look like danger from the outside. No fire, no collision, just a slow compression of options until there weren't any. He put the phone down and drove the rest of the way to Cedar Hollow. That evening, he was at the Calloway farm for what had become a Thursday standing arrangement. Dinner, which had evolved from breakfast, and then lunch into dinner through the same mechanism of gradual, practical inevitability that had governed most of the past 8 months. Sophie and Mia were at the kitchen table with the soil science project that had grown from a school assignment into something more substantial. A multi-section notebook on the specific history of the Calloway farm's soil, with data from Ethan's testing, photographs Mia had taken of the amendment process, and a comparative section on regional soil types that had started as Sophie's idea and that Mia had turned into actual research. Their teacher had asked to display it. Claire was at the stove. Ranger was under the table with his chin on Mia's foot, which was his preferred position during household activity. Available, connected, technically resting. Ethan was at the table with the 7 files. You're working, Claire said, without looking up from the stove. Reading. Same thing, with you. He looked up. She had her back to him, stirring something that smelled like the chicken and vegetable stew she'd made twice before, which he'd eaten both times without saying anything specific about it, but which she'd apparently noted. 7 families in the 5-county area, he said. Acute risk. I'm going to start making contact next week. She was quiet for a moment. All farms? Mostly. One's a market garden operation. One's an orchard. Same problems? Different details, same shape. He closed the file on top. Operating loans, balloon clauses, refinancing failures. The infrastructure of a system that works fine until it doesn't. She turned from the stove. Then you help them? Some of them, maybe most. He was honest about it. Not all. Some are past the window where the programs can reach them. But even those, knowing what's happening and why is better than not knowing. She looked at him for a moment. You're doing what you wish someone had done for your father, she said. He'd been looked at like that before. The thing where a person said an accurate thing about you directly, and you had to decide whether to acknowledge it or redirect. Yes, he said. She turned back to the stove. Good, she said. After dinner, when Sophie and Mia had taken Ranger to the back porch to do whatever they did on the back porch in the summer evenings, a ritual Ethan didn't entirely understand, but that involved a specific sequence of snacks and observations about the field that both children took seriously. Ethan and Claire sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the particular quiet of a house where the work was done and nothing was required. I've been thinking about something, Claire said. What? She wrapped both hands around her cup. The program. Mia's program. She paused. We had 6 families in June. We had 8 in July. Diane Briggs called me last week to say 2 families from Dawson County had reached out. They'd heard from someone who came in June, and they wanted to know if they could bring their kids. That's good. It's more than I planned for. She looked at the cup. I've been thinking about formalizing it. Not big, just enough structure to be sustainable. A nonprofit designation, maybe, or a fiscal sponsorship through the Extension Office. Diane said they could host it administratively if I wanted to keep the program at the farm. She looked up. Earl's wife Ruth offered to help. She has a background in nonprofit management from before she retired. Ruth Briggs ran a nonprofit? For 15 years, she managed a rural health access program in 3 counties. Claire almost smiled. Earl doesn't mention it often, I think he doesn't want people to know she's more qualified than he is. Ethan looked at the table. He thought about the structure, the way a formalized program created accountability and also sustainability, the way a fiscal sponsor reduced liability while maintaining operational flexibility. You'd need to think carefully about the mission statement, he said. The disability accessible component is specific enough to distinguish you from general farm education programs. That specificity makes you more competitive for certain grant funding. Claire looked at him steadily. You've thought about this. I've thought about adjacent things. You're doing it again. What? Making it smaller than it was. She set her cup down. Ethan, you think about things that relate to people you care about. You should just say that. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, through the screen door, Mia's voice carried from the back porch, explaining something to Sophie about the way the soybeans in the south field would look when they were close to harvest, the specific color change in the leaves, the way the pods felt when they were ready. Sophie asked a question Ethan couldn't make out. Mia answered it. Ranger made the low, contented sound he made when he was settled and wanted nothing. I think the program is important, Ethan said. I think Mia built something real today with those families, and she's going to build something more real over time. And I think formalizing it makes sense, and Ruth Briggs is probably an excellent person to help you do it. Claire waited. And I think about this farm, he said, more than is strictly professional. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I think about it too. He looked at her. She looked back. This was the part he was bad at, the part where the practical frame fell away, and what remained was just two people in a kitchen at the end of an evening, which was either simple or the most complicated thing in the world, depending on how you looked at it. I'm not, he started. I know, she said again. You don't have to have it figured out. I usually have things figured out. I know that too. She picked up her cup. You can have this one be different. He thought about that. About the difference between a problem and a situation, the way a problem required a solution and a situation required patience, and how he'd spent most of his adult life defaulting to the former because it was cleaner, because solutions were finite and situations were not, because caring about something you couldn't fully control was the one kind of risk that training didn't reduce. He'd told Mia he was afraid of getting things wrong when it mattered. She'd pointed out that he hadn't gotten this one wrong. Okay, he said. Claire looked up. Okay, he said again. I don't have it figured out. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod that meant that's enough for now, and stood to take her cup to the sink. He sat at the table and listened to his daughter's voice from the back porch, patient and interested, asking Mia what the field would look like in the fall. The harvest came in September, 6 months after the planting, which was how time moved on a farm, in large definite intervals, not the small daily accounting of other kinds of work. The South acres yielded 41 bushels per acre, which was below the county average but 14 bushels above what the depleted soil would have produced without the winter amendment. Ethan wrote the number in his own field notes and noted it against the soil test results from the fall survey, which showed measurable nitrogen improvement in the top horizon and the early signs of restored microbial activity in the amended zones. It was not a triumph, it was a data point, and the data pointed forward. Claire stood at the edge of the harvested field with the late September sun cutting low and gold across the stubble, and she looked at the cleared rows with the expression of someone who understood for the first time, not as a financial category but as a physical fact, that this was going to keep going. Mia was beside her in the chair, Ranger on her other side. Sophie was there too, standing in the stubble with her sneakers getting dusty, holding the same soybean seed she'd taken from the planting bag in April, which she'd kept in her jacket pocket through the summer, and which had somehow survived. It's the same one, she told Mia. It didn't grow, Mia said. It wasn't in the right conditions, Sophie said seriously. Mia looked at her. What are you going to do with it? Sophie considered. She looked at the harvested field, at the clear rows, at the pale blue sky of a Nebraska September. Plant it next spring, she said, when the conditions are right. Ethan was at the equipment shed, cleaning the harvester attachment, and he heard that through the open space between the shed and the field, and he stopped working for a moment. He'd come to Cedar Hollow to be quiet. He'd come to find a distance between himself and the kinds of situations that required the particular skill set he'd spent 14 years developing, because skill sets that sharp cut in both directions, and he'd needed to understand who he was without them before he could figure out who he was going to be next. He hadn't planned any of this. An 8-year-old in a wheelchair had rolled toward him on a cracked sidewalk on a cold October morning, and Ranger had stood up, and the rest of it had followed from there. Not because it was fated or arranged, but because Ethan Vance had learned, in 14 years of operating in places that required absolute clarity about what a situation actually needed, that the correct response to a person asking for help was to help. Everything else had been detail. He went back to cleaning the equipment. Ranger appeared at the shed door and sat down, watching him. "All right," Ethan said. He put down the cleaning cloth and walked out to where his daughter and the girl who had become her closest friend were standing in the harvested field in the September sun, and he stood with them for a while, and the field stretched out around them, quiet and finished and ready to begin again. There are people in the world who carry their capability quietly, who have learned things from hard places and bring those things to bear in ordinary moments without announcement. The world tends to misread them as cold or distant or strange, until the moment arrives when what they've learned is exactly what's needed. Strength isn't always what's loudest in the room. Sometimes it's the hand that steadies the wheel before the fall, the call made before the letter arrives, the path built to the width that was actually needed. And sometimes courage isn't standing tall. It's refusing to stop moving when someone you love needs you to reach them.